About 2 weeks ago, I visited my old school, my alma mater, the place where I did my undergraduate degree about 20 years ago, Simon Fraser University, also known as SFU. It is located on top of a small mountain in the Greater Vancouver area. Technically, it is in Burnaby, not Vancouver proper, but the city of Vancouver and its satellite cities together form one big metropolis, Greater Vancouver. And SFU is part of that big metropolis. But it's a little bit unique because it's on top of a little mountain. A mountain that's about 1,200 feet above sea level, and the base of the mountain is right at sea level. So, although it's not very big compared to the nearby North Shore Mountains, it is still a little mountain, and on the top of it, there is a university, and that's kind of neat. And the mountain itself has forests and stuff, so it's a very unique place. SFU is very unique. It's also a beautiful place. It has great views of the city and basically the landscape to the south going to the ocean and to the U.S. border, and to the North Shore Mountains, which are covered in snow until usually around mid-June, late June. Well, there's a few spots of snow, even in July. So it's a very beautiful place. It has great views. Now, the place itself, some people view as ugly. It has rather strange architecture. It was built in the 1960s, and I think you would call the style brutalist, but I'm not entirely sure if that's the right term. Or maybe hyper-modern, or something like that. It's blocky with a lot of exposed concrete. I'll put in a picture or two so you can get a sense of what I'm talking about. It's a strange-looking place because it has that 1960s kind of space-agey architecture, but also the architecture in those days was trying to be both hyper-modern and also kind of connected to nature. Anyway, some people find it oppressive because there's so much concrete. There's a lot of exposed concrete, and especially in the winter when it's often raining, it can be a little bit depressing. But I always kind of liked it. I kind of liked the place. I liked the feel of it. I liked that weird, retro, futuristic 1960s vibe, So I didn't mind the architecture. I enjoyed it. It even has weird indoor features. It has rubber flooring, this weird ribbed rubber flooring, which I think has been there since the 60s, and I don't think it's ever been changed. It's just been there pretty much forever. Anyway, so that's the setting, or the best I can describe it. It's a weird university on top of a small mountain, located in the metropolis of Greater Vancouver, British Columbia, in the current year of 2018. And when I was visiting there, I spent a couple of days staying in the dorms, because you can rent dorm rooms. You can actually do this at most universities and colleges, and it's a good way if you're traveling to save some money. And I was visiting some friends and relatives in Vancouver, so I wanted to get a place to stay. So I decided to stay at the dorms, and they have a 3-semester system, so there are classes all year round. Although there are fewer students in the summer, there are still quite a few students. So it was kind of interesting being back on my old campus. And when I was walking around, I had a powerful feeling of déjà vu. For the most part, it hadn't changed. There were a few changes, there were a few new buildings, but the core part of the campus was almost exactly the same as 20 years ago. And like even the rubber floors inside the AQ, those were the same. So I had that really strong feeling of deja vu, right? Of being there again, that feeling of familiarity and that kind of, flashback to an earlier time. And yet, superimposed on that feeling of familiarity, there was also a strong feeling of alienation. Because the students were different. The place was the same, but the students had changed quite a bit. See, when I went to school there about 20 years ago, back in the 90s, the student population was about 75% white. And now the student population seems to be about 50% Chinese, something like that, and less than 20% white. Based on what I saw, those are my estimates. I don't have actual data, so I'm just going off of what I saw, but I think that those are about right. For sure, East Asians are the dominant majority of the student population. And the remainder of the students are split between various races, and whites are a fairly conspicuous minority at this point. There are still whites. It's not like there are no white people at all. But they are somewhat conspicuous as a minority. And the change is not just in the racial composition of the student body. It is also in the culture. It is in the feeling of the place, the way that the students are acting. The culture is different. And partly that is language. Language is part of that. I heard Chinese spoken, I think, about as much as I heard English. Now, some of the Chinese students are foreign students, international students, but I'm pretty sure the majority of them are immigrants, or the children of immigrants. Vancouver always had, well, not always, but for a long time, Vancouver has had a significant Chinese population. So it has never been unusual, at least in the last, probably 100 years and certainly 50 years or more, to see Chinese people in Vancouver, and maybe even to hear Chinese spoken, although that was usually confined to, certain places. But the percentage of the population that is Chinese has hugely increased lately. And I think a lot of the immigrants coming in now are coming into Chinese communities where Chinese is spoken. So they're not really assimilating into the Canadian culture or learning to speak English, at least to the same extent as they used to. But whatever the case may be, I heard a lot of people speaking Chinese, and my overall impression was just that it felt very different. I can't concisely express it. There are a few things that I noticed, but it was more of an overall impression, like a gestalt. It just felt very different. Because Chinese people are different. They are different culturally, and they may be somewhat different biologically or psychologically. And so when you have a majority Chinese campus, it just feels different. It doesn't feel the same. Now, maybe some of this is due to the current year, right? Some of this is just, me getting older, and, what was cool or whatever 20 years ago is not cool now. The way students were acting 20 years ago is not the way they act now. However, I have been on other campuses recently, such as the University of Washington in Seattle and McGill in Montreal. And those places felt much more like the way things used to feel back in my day. And those places are still majority white, although they have a pretty big, I would say, foreign student population in the case of UW, but also they have, fairly large non-white contingents. So both of those places are certainly less white than they used to be, but not to the extent that SFU is. SFU is minority white, and the white minority is actually a fairly small minority, or at least that's what I saw. So things are just different. Now, some of the differences, again, might be due to the era, the time, the year. Like, I didn't see people reading books. You used to see students sitting around outside or whatever, or on little, nooks and crannies, reading books, drinking coffee, having conversations. I didn't see as much of that. I saw more just people going from one place to another, or sitting in study carrels studying. I think if the place were majority white, then it would still feel like McGill or the University of Washington, or kind of like it used to feel back in the day. There would be changes, but it would feel like European intellectual life, right? And we all know what that is, even if we can't define it. We kind of know what European intellectual life is. And I might not even be a big fan of it, but I can still be kind of sad to see it go. You have students, young people, not just studying, but also talking about life, talking about the big questions of life, reading Shakespeare, reading Nietzsche, trying to be creative, and it's part of a continuum of European culture that has been evolving for thousands of years, right? You have students reading Plato and Aristotle, and also the more recent philosophers like I don't know who's a good example, Daniel Dennett or whatever, right? And talking about the meaning of life and language and art and all that stuff. And that is gone. I didn't see that. Now, that doesn't mean that Chinese people don't have their own version of that. I'm sure they do, but it is different. It is their own version. And, it doesn't carry on those traditions, those memes. It doesn't carry forward the culture. So what I saw was replacement. It was the Great Replacement. One people had just been replaced by another, mainly by Chinese, but also by South Asians. There were a few blacks. There were some, Middle Eastern looking people, a few women in headscarves, all that stuff. So whatever was there before is gone. It's just gone. And the few white people who were walking around seemed like outsiders. They seemed isolated, and they just seemed like they didn't really belong. Like they were just there passing through. And this is the effect, the predictable effect and inevitable effect of the policies of the last, not just 20 years, but I would say 30 or maybe 40 years of mass immigration, combined with relatively low fertility. The white population of Canada is being replaced. It's that simple. And the effects are greater in the Vancouver area because it has received a lot more immigrants, especially from China, also from South Asia. And that has driven up house prices because a lot of those immigrants were quite rich. It has driven up house prices, rents, all of that stuff, increased traffic. And a lot of white people have left. They have moved away to places where they can afford houses, or just because they want a better quality of life. And then the ones that stayed didn't have very many children. And so within just 20 years, SFU went from being a majority white school to a majority Chinese school. So that great replacement happened within about 20 years. In my lifetime, in my memory, I saw it. Like I can remember the way it was before, and I can see the way it is now, and I can compare the two things in my mind. So that was kind of a shock, seeing it. I mean, I know these things intellectually, but it's different to see them and feel them. It felt very alienating, and it made me feel kind of sad. Because, like I said, whatever was there before, even though I may not have fully agreed with it or liked it or whatever, I was part of it and I was connected to it in a way that I am not part of or connected to whatever is there now. When I was there, they had the club day, the day when the campus clubs set up booths to attract new members from the arriving students. And that was kind of odd. One thing I saw that struck me as very odd was a club for Chinese students, like specifically for Chinese students. It was something like C-Link or Chinese Link or something like that. And it struck me as odd because the campus is majority Chinese, and almost every other booth had Chinese students sitting at it. So almost every club on campus was Chinese. And yet there was also a club specifically for Chinese students. There were a few white students wandering around there, but mostly there were Chinese students going from booth to booth. I saw a few South Asians as well, but it was majority Chinese, right? And there were no clubs for white students. There were no, clubs for Canadian heritage or, meet people from your ethnic background for whites. But there was a club for Chinese students. And that struck me as kind of bizarre. Like, why would they need a club? Like, we need a club so we can hang out, so we can find people who have our background. No, they're everywhere around you, right? I mean, it made about as much sense as a club for white students would have made back when I went there. It would have made no sense. And now it would make sense to have a club for white students or people of European heritage or, to celebrate European culture or something like that. But there were no such clubs, of course, because that would be considered racist and exclusionary, even on a campus that is minority white. Right? Now we're seeing cases where whites are minorities, where whites are relatively small minorities within Canada, and they're not allowed to assert their identity. They're not allowed to have their own spaces. They're not allowed to have their own, clubs or anything like that. And they still have to walk on eggshells around people of other races, even when they are a minority. So anyway, that was my experience at my old school. It was very strange. And this, in a microcosm, is... Well, I wouldn't say that it represents what's going on around the West because Canada is kind of a special case, but it does represent, to some extent, what is going on in Canada. And I'm going to go through a few statistics on the racial demographics in Canada that will give you a sense of how rapidly it has changed, like how rapidly the population is being replaced. From 1996 to 2016, so that's a 20-year period, the visible minority, which is, in Canada, that's defined as the non-whites, but it excludes the Aboriginal people, the natives. So it's non-whites who aren't natives. I'm not sure why they use that term, but anyway. The visible minority population of Canada roughly doubled, going from 3.2 million to 7.7 million. And in percentages, that is from 11.2% to 22.3%. This is from Wikipedia, so if the statistics are wrong, you can blame Wikipedia, unless I read them wrong, but I'll put a link in the description. So it basically doubled, right? The visible minority population doubled. And this has had a much bigger effect in places like British Columbia and Ontario, because those are the main destinations for immigrants. I don't have a statistic for 2016, although I saw one the other day. I know that the visible minority population of British Columbia is over 30% by now. It's definitely over that. I know that it was 27% in 2011. I think it was something like 30 or 33% in 2016. So it is significantly higher in British Columbia. And the effects of immigration have been concentrated mostly in the big cities, although you can see them almost everywhere, like even middle of nowhere in Newfoundland or Prince Edward Island or Saskatchewan. If you go to somewhere like a Tim Hortons, you're very likely to see a Filipino person serving you because they have some program that brings in foreign workers. So immigration has not been just to the big cities, but those are the major destinations. And so they have changed the most. I don't have the statistics for 20 years ago. I wish I did. But I have the statistics for 2016, and I'll give you those. The city of Vancouver proper, like the actual political city of Vancouver, was 52% visible minority in 2016. So that means it was about 52% non-white, or a little more because you got to throw in the natives as well, right? The city of Burnaby, where SFU is, was 64% non-white. So whites are a minority in both of those cities, and those are both fairly large components of Greater Vancouver. Surrey, which is a city to the south of Vancouver, was 59% non-white in 2016. And Surrey is highly South Asian. So I think that's mostly South Asians, like people from India or Pakistan, mostly India. Richmond, which is another city south of Vancouver and a major destination for Chinese immigrants, was 77% non-white in 2016. I don't have figures for the entire Greater Vancouver area, but those are the biggest cities. And so it's almost certainly a minority white metropolis at this point. Now, whites might still be the largest minority, but they are a minority. Other big cities in Canada are going through similar transformations. Toronto was 52% visible minority. And by the way, if I said non-white before, that's an approximation, again, because visible minority doesn't include natives. So those are underestimates of non-white. And if I said non-white, I meant visible minority. Okay. Toronto was 52% visible minority in 2016. Montreal was 34%, and Calgary was 36%. So those are fairly big percentages, right? I was a little bit surprised for Montreal because although I have noticed that it has become more racially diverse over the last, 10, 15 years, because I go there every now and then, so I'm familiar with Montreal, and I've noticed the changes. I didn't think it was that high. And I was looking at the satellite cities of Toronto to compare them to the satellite cities of Vancouver, and you see the same general pattern. The satellite cities often have even larger percentages of non-whites. For example, Brampton, which is a fairly large city within the Toronto area, was 74% visible minority, and Markham was 78% visible minority. And those two cities together, I think, are roughly 1 million people. So I'm not talking about little towns or little suburbs. Those are significant chunks of population. In Canada, you have to go pretty far from the big cities to see an overwhelmingly white population, to see the kind of population that was the norm 30 years ago, or even 20 years ago. And the other thing you have to keep in mind is that non-whites almost certainly make up a larger percentage of young people than of the overall population, because people tend to immigrate at lower ages, and the white population in Canada is getting quite old because it has low fertility, right? So the white population is older and the immigrant population is younger. I don't have statistics on that, but that's what I would infer from what I know about fertility and the fact that most of the immigrants are not white. Although some are. There are white immigrants as well. And this flow of people is not slowing down. In fact, it is being increased by the current government, the Liberal government with our Prime Minister Trudeau, that's, infamous. And this increase in immigration is being done in spite of all the problems that it causes. And it does cause a lot of problems. One of the biggest is housing affordability. These days, Canadians simply can't afford houses. It's certainly not in the big cities, like not in Toronto, not in Vancouver. You can still afford a house in Montreal. But in Vancouver, forget about it. Like, forget about a condo even. Forget about renting a nice apartment even. It's really bad. Canada has high taxes. It has overloaded infrastructure because they keep piling more people into the same places. And although they, of course, do upgrade the infrastructure, any benefits from those upgrades are just eliminated by the new people that are getting added every year. Wages are stagnant, right? Because immigration has a depressing effect on wages. So young Canadians don't have a bright future. What do they have to look forward to? They can't buy a house. They'll pay a lot of taxes if they do manage to get a good job. But their wages will be kept low by competition with immigrants. And they'll have to fight traffic every day to and from work, and they'll have to wait to see a doctor, and their kids might not be able to get into a school, and, so on and so forth. And the politicians don't seem to care, right? And you're not allowed to complain about immigration. It's not that there's a law against it, but the media will just shut you down. Like, they will not allow those opinions to be aired. And the public are being constantly propagandized that immigration is wonderful and diversity is wonderful and blah, blah, blah. And if you say anything to the contrary, or even you're somewhat critical of the immigration policies, you will be speech policed by the media or, by whatever. Like, you will be silenced one way or another. So there's very little, open criticism of the immigration policy, even though it's not terribly popular. And so it just continues. The flood of people just goes on, regardless of whether people want it, and you're not really allowed to criticize it. And it is just washing away what was there before and replacing it with something else. And I don't see a utopia emerging out of this process. Now, that doesn't mean I hate immigrants, or I hate people of other races, or I hate Chinese people. Some of my best friends when I was young were Chinese. Some were natives. I've had a lot of friends of different races. I kind of like a certain amount of diversity. I do actually kind of enjoy it. I guess I'm a liberal at heart because I do kind of like having people of other races around, as long as they're decent people. So I don't mind living in a society with people of other races. And I don't mind some level of immigration. But what we have, not just in Canada, but in the West in general, is population replacement. And it's not a balanced system. It's not like we can go there and they can come here. It's all just them coming here and replacing us, right? Maybe if I could just move to China, live there and take advantage of their cheap housing and stuff, and they would welcome me there and treat me really well, maybe I wouldn't mind. But that's not the way it is, right? They can come here, we treat them really well, we give them all kinds of advantages, but we can't go there. And what this is producing does not feel like a utopia. It feels like an airport. It feels like a place where people just pass through on their way somewhere else, where no one has anything in common with anyone else, and there's no real culture, there's no sense of historical continuity, there's no real past, there's no sense of a shared future. It's like an economic unit that imports people, exports natural resources, imports manufactured goods, and that's it. It's just like, it's kind of like that dystopian society in which everything is reduced to production and consumption, and that's it. Canada is not a utopia. People have really weird ideas about Canada. Canada has beautiful scenery, but people have to live here, right? You can't just live off the scenery. And what Canada really is a land of just miles and miles of cookie-cutter housing with generic strip malls, with Starbucks and Tim Hortons, and all the other chain stores. Everything is done by the government or mega corporations. There are very few little family businesses providing services. Canadians, I don't know, they think their healthcare is some big deal, but it's nowhere near as good as what you get in the United States. And you often have to wait a long time to see a specialist, so you don't want to get cancer here. And people have no sense of connection to this country because they didn't earn their citizenship by, working here for a long time and putting down roots, and they just bought their citizenship, or they came in through some pipeline that was arranged by some company or whatever. And so the people coming here don't seem to have much respect for Canada or any kind of emotional investment in it. They just see it as a place to get ahead, right? And maybe to escape from where they came from. And the people who are born here are increasingly alienated from the place because it doesn't care about them, right? It doesn't give a damn about them. And it doesn't really offer them very much. It's actively replacing them. So it's just treating them like disposable and replaceable cogs. It doesn't give its citizens a sense of a shared future or a shared past or shared values or really anything. There's just no sense of belonging. And that's what it feels like to be a Canadian. And it's becoming a harder and harder place to live. And I don't see much of a future for my children in this country. So, yeah, it's just kind of depressing. That's what it is. I wish I had a country that actually represented my interests. A country that had a future that people like me were going to be part of, right? That we had a future in this country. That doesn't mean everyone else has to be excluded, but we have to feel like we have a future. But we don't. I mean, I don't know where this is going. But when you see something like this, fairly rapid replacement of one set of people by another, washing away their culture and everything in a single, not even in a generation, what future will there be for my children or my grandchildren in the country where I was born? Every place in the West is the same now. They're all turning into airports. They're all countries that are just run for the interest of elites and sort of maintain the current welfare schemes until everything comes crashing down. Yeah, it's just a country without a future and a civilization without a future. So that's what it is. We have no countries, right? That's just the way it is. All right, I'll end it there. Thanks for listening.